Good afternoon. I hope you've had your legendary law school pizzas. I know it always works with students. I'm not sure how it will go down with you. So thank you for coming back and not disappearing into the gray outside. We're very fortunate to have with us this afternoon Professor Charlotte Bunch. I was so tempted to do what I saw being done at the Academy Awards, like, this is Meryl Streep who needs no introduction, and the guy walks off the stage. but I can't walk off the... So, Charlotte Bunch, founding director and senior scholar of the Center for Women's Global Leadership, Rutgers University. Charlotte has been an activist, writer, organizer in the feminist and human rights movement for over 4 decades. Distinguished professor in women's and gender studies, Charlotte was previously a fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies in D.C. and a founder of Washington, D.C. Women's Liberation. Charlotte sits on several board of directors of many organizations. She has written numerous influential essays, edited anthologies, authored books, articles, and yes, ma'am. We have discussed and we have decided, you may be surprised to see 3 of us here, not those 2 again, but we have decided to switch a bit the format of today's keynote. Also because Charlotte has a bit of a laryngitis, and we had fun doing this last night. So, I'll kick off. I think the great thing about having Charlotte here is Charlotte comes with so much experience. I'm sorry, I'm being very familiar with you. A wealth of experience and a wealth of involvement that you can share with us. So I'll start off by asking you perhaps if you could share with us about your involvement in the international human rights movement, its history, and specifically to talk about women's rights as human rights.
Thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and I hope you'll bear with me if my voice comes and goes a little bit along the way, but I didn't want to miss the day. I wanted to sort of position a little bit this discussion about due diligence and violence against women in the intersection of feminist theory and experience around violence against women and human rights thinking about particularly the concept of due diligence, but also international standards and mechanisms. And I think this project and this whole conference really situates us in what I think is one of the most exciting, both intellectually and politically, engagements between feminism and human rights. And to me, as a person who comes out of the feminist movement, but really was grounded even before that in the U.S. civil rights movement and resonated always with the concept of human rights, what's exciting about this work is that I think it's really bringing together 2 strands of major thinking that have had a huge impact on the world in the last half century and continue into this century, which is the feminist women's movements, revolutions, women's rights, however you want to call it, and the tradition of human rights since the end of World War II in particular. And in particular, I'm going to talk about human rights since the Vienna World Conference in 1993, which is, I think, the point at the end of the Cold War that human rights thinking also really burst forward as a much more dynamic force beyond just sort of a civil libertarian framework or the argument between civil rights and social and economic rights in the pre-Cold War period. So to me, the work on violence against women is at the intersection of these ideas, particularly with this due diligence framework. And many of you have experienced parts of this history. But I wanted to say something about my own history and why I think this is such an exciting discussion. And I say discussion because I always say in my class I teach on gender and human rights that we are in the middle of these changes. We are not at the end. This is not something that you teach as past history. This is something that is still being that is still evolving. And to me, that's what's exciting, and it means that all of you in the room either already are part of it or can become part of it, because it's got many more decades of work, I think, before we're going to see sort of where this will take us. I entered this as a U.S. feminist in the 70s. I was very engaged in the U.S. National and local movement living in Washington, D.C., and it was a very exciting time. And that's really the period when the issue of violence against women began to emerge on the public agenda in the U.S. I was not working on that issue. I was working in other areas at the time. And what really changed for me is I felt Reagan came to Washington in 1980, and I moved to New York and said, this town is changing, time to get out. Symbolically, I actually have to say that I moved even before the election, so I think I had an idea what was coming. But I moved because I wanted to bring my U.S. experience into an international discussion. And I felt that we were somewhat stalled in terms of some aspects of U.S. feminism, and that there was a lot we could learn from finding out how were women working on and defining these issues elsewhere. And that's really the first thing I want to say. Even in 1979-80, there were feminists in many parts of the world. This history is often denied, and it's very important. Feminism did not only arise in the West. Feminism was arising and very vibrant, particularly in South Asia, in Latin America, in the Philippines, maybe a little bit later in the Middle East and Africa, but there had been previous rounds of feminism in the national and anti-colonial movements. So there's a long history of feminism all over the world. So when I talk about feminism, I don't think it's just a Western phenomena. I think it is a global phenomena, and I wanted to understand how we could actually strengthen our work in the United States by engagement with the international systems, including the human rights system, but also mostly at that point through thinking about what were women defining as their issues and their strategies around the world. So I worked through the 80s in several different capacities, but what I want to say is that I came to see the issue of violence against women as one where women could learn from each other perhaps the most, because it was an issue in which no country, and especially the United States, had solved the problem. And particularly at that time in the early 80s, we were very clear that we were raising violence against women domestically because we had a violence epidemic on our hands, which now the WHO has confirmed around the world as 1 in 3 women experiencing some form of violence in their lifetime, at a minimum, probably even more. And I came to that work on violence because I saw in 1980 at the World Conference on Women in Copenhagen, which was a very divided conference where there was very little dialogue and a lot of conflict. The one area I was organizing international feminist networking workshops, and the one area where women really talked to each other and began to, not to say that it was the same, but to see that there was a common problem, were the workshops that had to do with violence against women. And I said, there's something here that we can use to help build our dialogue across North, South, East, West, and developed so-called and developing nations by how we see that we are all experiencing violence against women. Not that that experience is all the same, and I want to affirm the intersectionality approach to understand that violence takes many different cultural forms and many different intersections, but the dynamic of violence against women, the dynamic of domination and control, and right now I am speaking specifically of violence against women, we can talk about where that intersects with other forms of gender-based violence, is a common dynamic all over the world. And the ability to talk about that with each other enabled us to cross over lines, not by saying we were all the same, but by saying we have a common problem. It's taking many forms. How are you addressing it in your context? How am I addressing it? How can we begin to work together on it? So I started working on violence against women in the international context. I had not done that work in the U.S. before. And I've never done the ground level work, so I learned from all of you who have. Secondly, why human rights? My conversion to the notion that we had to establish what we now call women's rights as human rights, or a feminist interpretation of human rights, which is what I think it is, really came through the early 80s in working on issues of female sexual slavery, of sexual torture of women, looking at the work that was being done in Latin America, of sexual torture of women prisoners in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and particularly looking at the situation of refugees and women who were refugees of violent conflicts, like the Bangladesh-Pakistan war, which is interestingly back in the news today, but women who were raped in that war from Bangladesh were asking for asylum in Europe, and they were not getting it. And they were not getting it because rape in war was not seen as a human rights issue. And the notion that we now begin to have today, that this is a part of the human rights agenda, was simply unheard of. And these women were being essentially sent home. Women who were trafficked into sex tourism, if they wanted to leave, they were not given refugee assistance to either resettle or go back on their own terms. They were facing either being criminalized or being deported. Women who were in all of these kinds of situations that we think of today as involving human rights were not seen as part of the human rights agenda, unless it was women who already fit a classic human rights profile, like a political prisoner. Then you were still seen as a political prisoner, but the gender-specific aspects of that were not recognized. So many women throughout the 80s, and I want to say this because I think that the notion of women's rights as human rights really came out of the global networking that women were doing in the 80s, much of which was under the radar in terms of the media. And women were having these conversations. Probably the height of that was in 1985 in Nairobi at the Third World Conference on Women, which from my point of view is really the most important world conference, because it's the one where women feminists recognized each other as being in a global movement and really began to network. There's all kinds of networks on women law and development in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, on women living under Muslim laws, came soon after that and built some of its organizing in Nairobi. My work was certainly totally informed by Nairobi in terms of the possibility of women working together, but specifically of women beginning to take on this question of human rights. And why was that important? I think it was really important for several reasons. One is that we began to realize that the reason that women were not getting seen as victims of human rights is because we still had a male, mostly white male, mostly Western male, propertied interpretation of human rights from the past century. And that's why human rights was sort of stuck in the civil liberties box. But we, as women, began to look at, well, what does it mean to think about the violation of women's human dignity? Where are your rights most violated? In China, for example, UNDP, the UN Development Program, did a survey with women on where did they experience the greatest sense of violation, and they said violence against women. This was in the 80s, before anybody in the UN was doing work on violence against women. Women in Latin America were going to the UN Development Fund and saying, the main obstacle for us to development is violence. So these kinds of recognitions were happening on the ground. They weren't yet formulated into an international system. And so what happened is that many of us began to talk to each other about how could we bring a feminist, I call it feminist, others would just call it women's, but I think it's feminist politics, feminist thinking, to human rights. How could we make this understanding of the specificity of how gender and violence, not only violence, but gendered social and economic rights issues, gendered forms of political harassment in all its areas, had to be on the human rights agenda. We were also benefiting from looking at other issues that had been brought to the human rights agenda, like the disappeared in Latin America, which broke open the traditional notion of only states are responsible and began to talk about quasi-states and the responsibility of the state for what military or quasi-military or quasi-state powers do. So the notion of state and non-state was beginning to be challenged, the notion of public-private, but not yet full force. Indigenous people have challenged some of these with their struggles around human rights in this same period. So we weren't alone. There were many challenges, and of course the most important one for Vienna, besides women, was the challenge to the so-called first and second generation, that somehow civil liberties rights were more important than social and economic rights. And that was the other great breakthrough in 1993 in Vienna, was to say these are indivisible, they are not prioritized, they may be, you may achieve them in different ways. And I think the due diligence principle is a part of that understanding, that you achieve social and economic rights, you achieve some of these changes through progressive realization, through different mechanisms. So I think that this is how we came into the human rights movement. There are many different moments. I hope to write about all the different places that women were doing this. In the Philippines, women were declaring women's rights are human rights. At the Amnesty International meeting in 1989, the annual general meeting, the caucus of women in Amnesty had organized a women's panel where we tried to get them to recognize domestic violence. They weren't ready yet, but 20 years later, they had a major campaign on violence against women. So this is how change happens, and that's really what I want to say. These things happen because many people, mostly women, but many people who wanted to broaden and interpret human rights in a more dynamic way began to link together. And we who were feminists learned about human rights at a much deeper level, particularly in terms of standard setting, the use of international mechanisms, due diligence, the ability to document effectively. So it was not a one-way street. The women were also learning what I consider to be very valuable theory and practice of human rights, about how to make the things that we cared about actually more effective. And in that regard, that was, I think, the other reason that we really wanted to take on human rights, was to give women access to this knowledge that the human rights system had developed of how to work effectively in documenting and challenging, and particularly in demanding accountability. Demanding state accountability, not only for what the state did, but for what non-state actors were allowed to do within the state. And this is at the heart of the Vienna Tribunal. Some people here may know about. We did a women's tribunal. We did a women's campaign for the 1993 World Conference, which really shifted dramatically and the perception of what women's rights were really all about. So I'm going to stop right there and let you take another question and give me a little break.
I'll speak slowly. No.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that very exhaustive narration of the evolution of the feminist involvement in human rights. I was just thinking about some of the things you said, how feminism is deemed a Western concept, you know, and this is the same with human rights, yeah. And it's a question of labeling, yeah. It's if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So if feminism is practiced in other countries, it is feminism, and whether you call it feminism or not, it is feminism, and this is a perception that exists here in the West and the East. The East also rejects it, and the West plays into it. So both sides are feeding into this discourse. And the other thing is, thank you so much for the work you have done. Really, I wish I was there in 1983, 1993. It sounded so exciting, and I remember watching the video on the Vienna conference, the Women's Tribunal that you did. It's powerful. For those of you who have not seen it, please take time to look at the Women's Tribunal at the Vienna conference. A powerful message on women's rights, our human rights.
I also wanted to comment before getting to my next question that, as I was saying last night when we had another interesting conversation, I used to say we young people. Now I have to say they young people. It's a little uncomfortable transition. But so I think it's good for those young people to hear that a lot of the gains that we take for granted are recent, and they were hard fought. And we have the privilege of being in the room with a lot of the pioneers for the gains that we've had. So holding not only state but non-state actors, or state actors accountable for the acts of non-state actors. So what happens in a home, in a living room, you can go to the state and hold them accountable for that if they knew or should have known, if there were so I think, or considering women's rights as human rights, or even being able to talk about violence against women in the public sphere, or that rights are indivisible. That you can't just talk about violence against women in a vacuum without talking about the economic impact. So all these things that I think we happily take more or less for granted are somewhat recent, and they were hard fought, and they were definitely not the assumption, I think, back in the day. Not so back in the day. So we did hear you speak about how and why you entered the international arena and how that came to pass. Now I'm wondering if we shift it to human rights and its application at home in the U.S., how you see the application. What is human rights at home? What is the relationship with civil rights? A lot of times I hear and we hear, well, we don't need human rights. We have civil rights. We don't need international law. We have domestic law. So how is that relationship between international human rights law and domestic? What can it stand to gain? What is the value added? And some maybe examples of where you've seen it positively applied.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to just announce one bit of good news. Some of you may not know if you're not Washington, D.C. junkies, which I still am a little bit, even though I'm working in New York. The National Conference for Civil Rights has been one of the leading kind of coalitional points for civil rights movements in the United States. Recently changed its name to the National Conference for Civil and Human Rights. And this is a mainstream Washington, D.C. group. There's also a national network called the U.S. Network for Human Rights, I think it's called. U.S. Human Rights Network, thank you. These are all developments of the last decade, and I actually am very optimistic that, probably not for good reasons, but that human rights always proceeds, not always because things are positive, that we are moving in the direction of people understanding the importance of human rights in the United States and the importance of U.S. struggles connecting. But I found it very frustrating, I will say, 25 years ago when I began to talk about women's rights as human rights and violence against women as a human rights issue with many of my domestic colleagues working on violence against women, because I was constantly met with, well, what difference does it make? And I think there is a myth in the United States that goes with the notion of the United States as exceptional, that somehow human rights is for the rest of the world, and we have plenty of our own national domestic laws and civil rights. Well, let me tell you, I think that's not the case. I think that we have so much to gain from identifying with the human rights struggles of people around the world and bringing our national domestic issues to alignment with that. Someone mentioned this morning in the question and answer about those laws in Massachusetts. Same thing in Washington, D.C., cutting food stamps. This is a human rights issue. This is a social and economic human rights issue, that this effort to cut food stamps, to cut people off from the provision of basic survival. There is a lot of work in the international community on economic and social rights about that kind of issue. We should be using that. I'm not saying we'd win, but we should be using it, because if we were identifying those kinds of issues, like that threat to cut food stamps, that threat to cut off any kind of assistance to people who are below the poverty line or whatever that is. These are classic human rights issues, and I think we have much to gain from beginning to argue that we demand this kind of human rights accountability in the United States. Now, the national government of the United States has not fully accepted social and economic rights, and this is something that goes way back to the Cold War and the so-called, communist capitalist debate, et cetera. I think it's time we challenge that much more effectively using these international instruments, some of which the U.S. has signed and some of which it hasn't. It hasn't signed CEDAW. It hasn't signed the Social and Economic Rights Convention. It's the only country in the world that hasn't signed the Child Rights Convention, with the possible exception of Somalia that didn't have a government, though I think even they have declared they would if they had a government. So we have to look at why is our government so reluctant to sign human rights treaties and protocols that would make them more effective. Because the government doesn't want us using these in our domestic struggles. Well, hey, if they don't want us using this in our domestic struggles, maybe there's something there useful for us to use. They're very committed to preventing this. They're very committed to preventing CEDAW. Not all the government. I mean, CEDAW, we have a pretty classic party divide now. But overall, even many of the Democrats haven't been very enthusiastic to have social and economic rights implemented in the United States, and certainly not the others. So I think that if we would begin to identify the issues we're struggling with domestically with our sisters and brothers around the world who are struggling with those same issues, we would gain so much. And it's too much of international human rights has been somehow put into the category of us helping them. But I think it's about us helping ourselves and being in solidarity with others and working together. And if we just continue the paradigm of somehow we are okay, we have human rights, and we're just taking care of the rest of the world, we miss a huge opportunity for strengthening our domestic struggles. So I believe that around violence against women. I believe that around many of the other social and economic rights issues in particular. And I have no problem with acknowledging where we have advanced, where we do have legislation that's useful for other people. Absolutely. But if we engage with our partners and our sisters and brothers in the world in human rights struggles, we come to the table as people equally engaged in bringing the best of our practices and learning from each other. It's not to say that we have nothing to offer. We have a huge amount to offer from our own national struggles as well. So I believe it makes a huge difference. I saw the difference it made even for women in the United States when we first started the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence that some of you may know about, as a campaign that we started in 1991 to link violence against women to human rights, and goes from International Day Against Violence Against Women, which is November 25th, to Human Rights Day, December 10th. We put up our petitions to the UN World Conference declaring violence against women as a human rights issue in battered women's shelters all over New Jersey and New York, where we're based. And women said it made a difference, even if they didn't yet know what they were going to do. It made a difference when they saw that this issue was seen as an international human rights problem. It made a difference to their sense that they had the right to get some solution. It may not yet have given them the solution, but it had an empowerment effect, which I think we can never underestimate, that you have the right to something being different. That's where movements begin. The next step of that work, or many steps of that work, is what you see with the Due Diligence Project, which is, what is that right consist of? I was working on the, I brought it here, the Secretary General of the United Nations did a report in 2006 on violence against women, the first UN-wide report. There are many good UN reports from the World Health Organization and UNIFEM before, but this is the first sort of General Assembly UN-wide report. When we were working on that report, we saw the importance of outlining state accountability, but we kept having governments say to us, well, what are we supposed to do? And the chapter that was the hardest was supposed to be the chapter on good practices. And we renamed it Promising Practices because we felt we didn't have enough good practices yet. And that part of the problem was that we didn't have not only enough documentation of what was being tried, we also didn't have enough study or evaluation of which things actually worked, and that would make a difference to know what worked, where, and why, and that it might be slightly different in a different context, but to know that it worked in this country or here or there or didn't work. There were many interesting experiments going on, like the women's police stations in Brazil that then spread to much of Latin America, and people wanted to know, well, has it increased the number of women who actually bring their cases to the police? Has it increased the effectiveness of the redress and the prosecution? And there was very little information about that. So when you say data is dry, I tend toward the same bias. But I learned in working on that report how important the lack of data is. And the lack of data on violence against women, I think, reflects the lack of seriousness about the issue. It reflects a belief that it will never end. And I want to say, I think that undermines so much of our work, the belief that it is inevitable, natural, and it will never end. Now, I'm not saying every single act of violence between a man and a woman will end, but the dynamic of domination, of male control of women through violence can end. It can end in the same way that we ended slavery, but there's still slave-like practices. The same way that we ended institutionalized apartheid, but there's still problems of racism. So that's to say, you can change the institutional structure, and it makes a huge difference. It doesn't mean that every act of racism, of apartheid, of those kinds of practices or violence will end. But there is such a widespread belief that this is inevitable. So that's part of what challenging it with human rights means. Earlier this morning, you talked about human rights standards. To me, what human rights standards are, those are the standards that we say we would like to build a society in which these things do not happen. And until you say what those are, which is what the CEDAW Convention does around women, the Declaration on Violence, which is now kind of incorporated as an interpretation of violence in CEDAW, the regional conventions, that's what they do. They say this does not have to be. What the Due Diligence Project does is it starts to answer what governments need to do if this is not going to be. And I say starts because there's a huge amount of work to be done on that. We found so little in the 2006 report that I think that's partly why I became so enthusiastic about this project, because I don't think we will end the extent of violence until we get people convinced that you can do something about it, that states have a responsibility to do, that communities have a responsibility. I welcome the Men Against Violence movement because I think we also have to have men saying they have a responsibility for that violence in the same way that white people were challenged to say we have a responsibility for racism, that whether we are individually racist is not the point. We have a responsibility for the institutions of racism. And men have a responsibility, as do women, for the perpetuation of the institutions of violence against women. States play an important role. They won't solve it all, but they play an important role. Holding them accountable means having some ideas about what we want them to do and what we think they should be doing. Those ideas will change as mandatory arrests change. As we try them, we will learn that some work better than others, and the details will change. But the notion that there are things to be done and that resources deserve to be there, because we will never get there as long as we go on saying that there's no resources for it. and this is the U.S. and all over the world, the question of resources. Perhaps a few of the European countries have put in more resources, but very few have put in anything like the resources needed to address these issues. But all of this is part of bringing human rights home to the U.S., being a part of that kind of accountability, being able to make those claims. Your local work goes on, but you broaden the claim, and you get the power of the international claims. You get the power of connection to other people. You don't have to be involved in the movement everywhere, but maybe with one or two projects in another part of the world that are similar to yours, that you're sister projecting with, where you try out ideas. This is all part of what it means to me to bring international human rights home to the U.S.
No, not at all. Thank you very much. I do have a few more questions, but I'm going to hold off and start taking rounds from the audience, and we'll see if there's time for myself. So we'll take maybe 2 or 3 at a time, because that was a bit overwhelming from this morning, and then we'll give Charlotte a chance to respond. Oh, I think she needs to.
To answer them.
Yeah.
Hi, here. I'm interested to know what challenge do you see in the human rights movement in relation to women's rights specifically, and how can we actually construct or the linkage between these intersectionalities that we were talking about this morning with women of color, with women with disabilities, with all these intersectionalities that are really important because we all are women.
Any other?
Hi. I also have a throat issue. And my name is Hema, and I'm an immigration practitioner in Boston. And my question is actually that example that you gave of putting up posters in a shelter. It's something so tangible and very so empowering, as you said. I mean, I would love to hear, and maybe this is what we'll be talking about through the course of today, just other examples of how do we bring this framework into our day-to-day practices, whether we're working individually with survivors, whether we're working with different agencies, hospitals, law enforcement. So.
Hi, I'm Tiloma Jayasinghe. I'm with Sakhi for South Asian Women in New York. Thank you so much for your wonderful comments. I have a question. If you could please clarify who the we is you mean when you talk about we can do more to bring in human rights at home. I know there's a vibrant group of organizations working in the U.S., but a lot of them are larger mainstream or better funded organizations that are doing critical work, but there needs to be more done to bring it down to the community-based organization level, the organizations that work more with the marginalized and vulnerable communities, because the burden gets pushed onto us. I speak as one of them. I agree we need data. Like, there's one study we use for DV in the South Asian context in the US that's never been updated, but we don't have the capacity to gather that data. I definitely see linkages to other movements and intersections globally, but do I have the ability to do that myself? Even understanding it, there's a capacity gap. So I just wanted to, I know you have it, so I just wanted you to draw out who the we is and, ground that in that socioeconomic, race, class, that context. Thank you.
So, can you hear me? I have a question, because throughout the morning you've used, many of you used the word trafficking, and I want to bring up that yet usually creates distinctions, between forced and free, when a large number of women don't define themselves as, quote, trafficking under the legal definition, and yet they are brutalized in this sort of so-called sexual, industries of exploitation. And I feel like we need to understand that, because that's what we want to end, not just trafficking, because it sets up sort of divisions and distinctions. So I was just questioning, I guess, the language and how we can sort of, because language is important when we talk about all of this.
Take a pause now, and then we will, I believe, I also wanted to forecast or foreshadow that we'll also be getting much more examples about the application of the framework and how it plays out in the U.S. in the session after this as well. So here you go.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say the same. The next session hopefully will give you some more of that. But I think I want to speak to the first and the third question, which are really around the we and the intersectionality questions. You know, I think that the challenge in our human rights movements around women, well, there's a lot of challenges. The first one, I think we've done the hurdle of becoming visible. We may not have done the hurdle yet of being really seen as fully and centrally part of human rights, because I think there still is a kind of subtle hierarchy. For example, very few women's organizations get called to the table when the national human rights groups meet. So, you know, we still have work to do in that engagement, and the other way around. I think that women's groups are more than they used to be, but also need to be broad-based in our understanding of other human rights struggles and showing up for those. So, you know, it works both ways. And I'm not saying every individual can do it. We can only be so many places, or we lose our voice and our bodies, and you know what that's like. But I think as movements, we are better at doing that, but not yet where we need to be. And I connect that to intersectionality because for me, the trick with intersectionality, I was active in the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, a conference, a UN conference that unfortunately got overshadowed by 9/11 and has never received the attention and discussion it should have had. But one of the issues that we were struggling with was in trying to talk about exactly what this project does. What do we expect from governments? How do we want them to be intersectional? And we reached a point where we were trying to define a principle of taking account of intersectionality without ending up with a different set of laws for every situation. And I think this is really the challenge of this project, but also the challenge in working legally to get principles that will, to give an example, we were talking about the debate in the United States at that time, 2001, around mandatory arrest. And did it work for some people and not for other people? And should you therefore throw the whole thing out? Should you get rid of the mandatory part but still try to keep some notion that arrest was an important thing? And you know, we were like, but we don't want laws in the United States that say, well, for African American women, you need to take this account, and for this group that, endlessly, because then you get a specificity that isn't really helpful, because every woman's a different combination of intersections too. So I think that the real challenge for all of us is to think through how do we have principles that are broadly working with a principle of intersectionality built into that, which is to say that though in the implementation of these policies, one needs to look at what other intersections are at work, and not try, as we were struggling around this, around the World Conference Against Racism, not try to end up sort of spelling out every detail of what every group will experience, because that was threatening to also shatter us from any sense of having something in common that we were working for. So that's a really difficult balance, and it's one of the big challenges, I think, of women's rights work and the human rights framework. When I say we along that line, it's a good question. I mean, I'm kind of looking around the room and who's here, law students, people who work in human rights, women who work in violence, different settings. I think that for me, I'm often trying to get sort of mainstream human rights groups to not just leave it to those who are marginalized to bring these things up. And Saki, to me, would be a good practice, actually, of how one does this. But it's absolutely true, and this is an argument I have with funders, too, that the funding for more marginalized groups to do this work adequately is not there, and we won't really get all that data and that experience filled out until there's more of it. But I think there are many parts of that question. The immigration example, I will leave the rest to talk about some, but immediately I thought of, and this is again why I think it's important to have some cross-cultural references, I thought of all the different things women did with that petition. You could take the 5 Ps and have a very simple poster that was up in battered women shelters around the world that just said, these are the things that the state ought to be doing for you, as a way of reminding people that this is something that you can work for. And I think there are many different ways to talk about how you implement, not yet, and to me this is where human rights work is always struggling, not yet are you going to get all of it done. When we did the tribunal in Vienna, for example, we had to work really carefully with the women to understand that this was a symbolic public policy tribunal. Nothing legally was going to change about their case because they were testifying at a Speak Out or a tribunal in Vienna, even though it was a World Conference on Human Rights and the governments were there. The difference between a public policy forum to try to change those conditions and a legal change in your own case. I think that's part of the line that we also work on when we're dealing with individual cases. Because, of course, the woman who's abused is first and foremost trying to deal with her own situation. And you almost have to be beyond at some other point that you begin to be able to work toward how to change that situation. And that's what the women who testified did. We talked to them about how you're going to help change this for other women in the future. Your case won't be different. So there are many different levels of the work in which the actual prosecution is only a small percentage, but how that's done can affect all the others. I don't know that I want to get too much into the trafficking debate. This is a huge issue. But I do want to affirm that when I say trafficking, I'm referring to the industry of exploitation. And I do believe that there are, I'm also a supporter of sex workers who choose to be in that work and feel that's the choice they have. I don't think those, for me, those are not incompatible. I want to fight the way the industry has created and played on women's vulnerability, but I also want to fight on what making women vulnerable in the first place. So to me, those are all connected, the socioeconomic conditions of women, the industry, and the rights of the women who are in that situation so that they don't become the victims themselves and they have some decent working conditions. So although this is a very polarized debate in the women's movement, I don't believe it should be as polarized as it is. I think there are actually some pretty clear human rights guidelines through this debate, but that's for another discussion.
I think we'll take one or two or three question comments, brief please, and then we'll hear from Charlotte to respond and closing thoughts.
Dr. Bunch, thank you very much. I think you made an excellent point. I'm speaking from the perspective of a researcher as well, and I think your point in outcomes research is really important, and that is where everybody in this room has a role. NIJ will put out RFRs if they're aware of the work we're doing and what those outcomes are that we're trying to measure. And I would like to share with this group that the National Institute on Health has convened a group of researchers around this country on December 9th to come and meet with them, discuss where the research is on violence against women and where we see the gaps. And the purpose of that is to begin to create RFRs. So, and I think that many of us have really pushed them because NIH funding went away for a very long time on violence against women, but it looks like it's coming back, so there's opportunity. I just wanted to share.
Hi, my name is Rena. I'm with Shahali, and I'm going to ask a question about the public-private partnership in educating about human rights and violence against women. Is there any out there, and in the past, have you seen that with your other organizations that you've been affiliated with?
My name is Jenny Cantalupa, and I work for Somerville Police Department as a victim advocate, and I'm originally from Colombia. And my question is, are there any specific examples of policy change internationally that have minimized violence against women, and how do you achieve those changes?
Hi. Charlotte, I wonder if you could speak to just, what's the word? Hi, sorry. Given your history in bridging the gap between U.S. feminism and white women's feminism and meeting women from the rest of the world, any advice on encountering the constructs of religion and how they relate to the expectations and roles that women face and how that results in violence against them?
Okay, unless there's an exceptionally passionate plea, I think we will. I'm always a sucker for those. And we almost escaped without the religion question, Charlotte, but it got... He squeezed it in the end. So some brief responses and your closing remarks. Here you go.
Thank you. Well, I don't actually want to escape the questions of culture and religion because I think they're really important. But in a brief response, and then I'll come back to the other questions. To me, the most important things around this question are, one, every country has culture. Culture in the United States is a very important part of violence against women. The gun culture, the culture of violence against women in the media, you could name more. I experienced this on a campus. There's a new survey that UN Women did, and unfortunately I don't have the numbers with me, but it's on male sense of entitlement to sex, and the figures are really shocking. And those are cultural phenomena, and they are very present in the United States. This is, among the industrialized countries, one of the most violent for a country that's not at war, at least doesn't do its wars on our land, is at war on other people's land. This is a very violent culture. So not only to women, but to people of color and other marginalized groups, and I think all of that goes together. I'm a believer that cultural acceptance of violence in the home and in the family is very much interrelated with cultural acceptance of racial violence and violence of homophobia and violence of anyone who's different, and ultimately acceptance of militarism and the whole bit. Which is not to say that it's just something automatic where one will end and the other will end, but that we need to see that continuum of the pervasiveness of violence, and I think the gun issue was mentioned this morning, so et cetera. So for me, the first thing about dealing with culture and religion, which are not the same, is understanding that this is an issue everywhere in the world, and this is not just an issue elsewhere. So in my work as a white U.S. feminist, I'm always very much present at the table to talk about my own culture. I'm present to talk about fundamentalism in the United States, and where is it different and where is it similar to fundamentalism elsewhere? Where is religion being used? I spent some years in different parts of this country. Where is religion being used to support fundamentalist or anti-women ideas? I also spent a number of years being a progressive Christian. I don't believe that religion has to be regressive. I have seen and experienced a progressive version of my own religion. I've also seen it perverted and used for very anti-women things, and I think both tendencies are there in probably every religion. So for me, it's not about religion, but it is about how we interpret, who has the power to interpret, who's using religion, and how do women counter that. Some women choose to counter that from within the religion, and some choose to counter it from a secular position, which legally I would prefer that we have separation, but we don't have separation here either. We have at least some separation, but we don't have full separation. So I engage in the question of culture and religion as a person who understands how much those shape my experience and the experience in this country, and the need to change culture is not only about women. Every human rights issue, you can't tell me a human rights issue that doesn't in some way involve changing culture. If we're ever going to end the death penalty in the United States, which I think is an important human rights issue, we're going to have to change the culture of the United States about the death penalty. So for me, cultural change isn't the issue, or even religious change. Now, I know there are people who don't agree, but there's no religion in the world where there aren't many variations. So it's kind of automatically tells me that though some may claim they're the only real one, there's no proof that anybody's the only real one anything. And so we should have a dynamic discussion of how we want our cultures and religions to evolve toward what I hope would be more human rights values. And I don't think there's any reason that they can't if we are able to achieve that, which goes to your question about human rights education. I think human rights education in the schools would be extraordinarily helpful. I ask my students at the beginning of my class every year how many of them learned anything about human rights in their schools. And this is mostly New Jersey, but a sprinkling of others. Only a handful. So I think we've got a huge way to go to get some sense of what human rights means and why it's important embedded in our school systems as a part of what we're all working for. I know a few really great teachers who do that work. I don't think I can point to any, although maybe somebody else can, specific program, although I think there's some great curriculums, and I know some people doing that work. And I know there was some good work in a town in Argentina for a while that a woman I know was working with, where she got the town to take it up. So there probably are other examples. So far, that's why your question about policy changes that minimize violence. To me, the biggest challenge, and maybe this is how I'll end because I know we're about at the end, the biggest challenge we face in feminism and also in human rights and most human rights movements is that we have made a lot of gains in consciousness, and people who have access to those gains and who are individually strong in asserting themselves have different lives. There are a lot of people, a lot of women who have escaped violence because of the work that the movements have done on violence against women, because it has given them the idea that things can be different. It has sometimes given resources that help them get there. And there are individuals who will fight no matter what resources are out there. And these ideas are out there. It has had a change, but it has not had a change that you can really document yet as minimizing the continuation of those dynamics and institutions of violence. So to me, the real challenge we face is feminism, human rights. Many of us live very different lives because of these movements than we could have lived 50 years ago. And that's not just in the United States. That's all over the world. But it's not yet something that every woman and every man lives a different life. The violence has not ended. The dynamic of acceptance of the violence has not ended beyond a very kind of individual level that some people can access. So the real challenge is exactly that, to develop the policies, and I hope those will be things that you'll all talk about in the next 2 days, that will really minimize that violence. There's no question that we know some of the things that make it easier for women who are really ready to take what's there for them. But that's still not a large enough number. Thank you.
Okay. This has been a great hour, a quick hour. Hold that clap. I want to thank you on behalf of the project. Charlotte's been advisor to the project. We're eternally grateful. We're grateful for you pushing through a cold, cough, flu combo for being with us. And I think this has been great. We're going to, after this, take a short break. I'm sure Charlotte will be around and happy to talk with you. And then we'll come back and hear from Julie Goldschmidt, Deb Leibowitz, Carrie Betticher-Lopez, and Martha Davis, who will talk about the due diligence project in the U.S. context, which I think will be another fascinating session. So, yes, let's clap. Thank you.